Rome. One quiet evening, inside the palace, a banquet is underway. Silver goblets shimmer under torchlight. Laughter rolls through marble halls. Senators sip wine beside their wives as dancers spin and musicians play without pause. Then suddenly, a scream, a flash of steel, and the head of a Roman senator crashes to the cold stone floor. At the head of the table, the emperor gently lifts his glass. "Remove the body," he says, "and bring dessert." This wasn't war. It wasn't justice. It was performance. And for Caligula, emperor of Rome, performance was power. The next morning, the city whispered about what had happened behind closed doors. But no one dared speak too loudly, because they knew what came next. Just a week later, Caligula ordered his soldiers to line up along the coast of Gaul, facing the sea. He raised his hand and commanded them to attack the waves. Swords slashed at water. Shields rang. The ocean, of course, did not bleed. When it was over, Caligula told them to collect seashells from the shore. "Trophies," he declared, "from our war against Neptune." To the outside world, he was Rome's ruler. But in his mind, Caligula was a living god. And what happens when a broken man believes himself divine? What happens when absolute power answers to nothing, not even the gods? Caligula didn't rule Rome. He rewrote its rules. He didn't just defy tradition, he made tradition kneel. But here's the question history rarely dares to ask. Was he mad from the start? Or did Rome, in its silence, create him? This isn't just the story of a tyrant. It's a warning, a glimpse into how unchecked power becomes a sickness that infects an entire empire, wrapped in gold, drenched in blood. And it didn't begin with madness. It began with a child, a boy they once called Little Boots. Now let's go back to the beginning, before Caligula claimed godhood, before marble ships, ritual humiliation, and whispered screams. Back to the moment a boy watched his father die and realized something that would shape everything to come. In Rome, survival doesn't belong to the just. It belongs to those who know how to perform. He was born into the heart of Rome's most celebrated bloodlines, August 31st, 12 AD, in the coastal town of Antium. His name, long and imperial, was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. But history would not remember him for that. They would remember him by the nickname given to him as a child, a name born from affection, from soldiers amused by his miniature boots and toy-size armor. Caligula, Little Boots. At first it was a term of endearment, a boy walking beside his father in military camps, smiling at legions who saw in him a symbol of hope, of legacy, of the next great Caesar. His father, Germanicus, was everything Rome idolized, a beloved general, charismatic, honorable, adored by the army and the public alike. He was the man many believed should have been emperor instead of Tiberius. But glory has a cost in Rome, and admiration can be fatal. When Germanicus died suddenly in Syria under mysterious circumstances, whispers spread like wildfire. Some blamed poison, some pointed fingers at the powerful Praetorian prefect Sejanus. Others dared to suspect Emperor Tiberius himself, but young Caligula didn't have the luxury of grief. He watched the empire erase his father's image, the Senate speak his name less and less, and the love of Rome turn cold. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, refused to be silent. She publicly accused the emperor's court, demanded justice for her husband's death, and dared to challenge the throne. Rome doesn't tolerate defiance, not from men, and certainly not from women. Agrippina was exiled. Caligula's two older brothers died under mysterious and brutal circumstances. And one by one, his family was dismantled by the very system they once served. Only Caligula remained, maybe because he was still young, maybe because he knew how to stay quiet, or maybe because Rome needed a pawn more than it needed another martyr. Tiberius summoned the orphaned boy to Capri, his private island palace, beautiful and cursed. There, away from the eyes of the Senate, under marble statues and endless banquets, Caligula grew up surrounded by perversion, cruelty, and fear. Capri was no sanctuary. It was a school of survival, a place where loyalty meant watching silently as others fell, a place where power was practiced through whispers and sharpened through betrayal. And while others flattered, flinched, or died, Caligula did the one thing Tiberius admired most. He learned. For 6 years, the boy watched his aging, paranoid predecessor rule through terror. He learned when to speak and when to disappear. He learned how to smile while seething, how to entertain monsters without becoming their prey. By the time Sejanus fell and was executed, Caligula had already earned his place beside the throne, not through love, but through perfect obedience. And when Tiberius finally died, some say with a pillow pressed gently to his face, Caligula emerged from the shadows, no longer the boy in little boots, but the heir to the world's greatest empire. The crowds in Rome roared with joy. Statues were raised, coins minted, prisoners freed. A new golden age had begun, or so they believed. But beneath the cheers, the trauma still festered. The boy who had lost everything now held everything. And in that terrifying silence after victory, he was left alone with the one question no emperor should ever be left to answer by himself. Who am I, now that no one can stop me? When Caligula became emperor in the spring of 37 AD, Rome exhaled. After the long, cold shadow of Tiberius, a ruler feared more than loved. The arrival of this young, charismatic heir felt like sunlight piercing a wintered empire. The people cheered as if a prince had returned from exile. The Senate, eager to align itself with the rising star, showered him with titles and decrees. They named him best and greatest of Caesars, and for a brief, shimmering moment, it felt true. He seemed to be everything Rome had hoped for, the lost son of Germanicus now restored, the child who had grown up among generals and gods now ascending to claim his birthright. And Caligula, it seemed, understood the weight of that expectation. His first acts were deliberate, generous, and widely celebrated. He ordered the release of prisoners held by Tiberius. He ended unpopular taxes. He reversed exiles, welcomed back political outcasts, and declared public holidays filled with games, theater, and grand processions. The imperial treasury, once guarded like a paranoid secret, was opened wide for the people. Rome felt reborn. Statues of Germanicus were reinstated. Public monuments once torn down were rebuilt. His mother, Agrippina, was posthumously honored. His family, erased by imperial silence, was now praised from the Senate floor. For a people raised on bloodlines and symbolism, it meant something profound. Rome believed they had found their new Augustus. For the first 100 days of Caligula's reign, there was laughter in the streets again. Bread flowed, wine poured, and no one was afraid to speak. Citizens watched their young emperor ride through the city in white robes, smiling, waving. He was the image of virtue and youth. Even the Senate dared to hope. They believed they could guide him, shape him. Perhaps this time, they thought, the prince could be molded into a king who ruled with reason, but empires built on memory are easily deceived by nostalgia. Behind the parades and public declarations, cracks began to show. Quiet ones at first. He demanded statues of himself placed in every temple, not yet as a god, but already as something more than mortal. He asked the Senate to declare his birthday a national holiday. His palace, once sparse under Tiberius, began to swell with gold, mirrors, and imported silks. When criticized in private, he had the speaker brought before him, not for punishment, but for a dinner, where he would recite the man's words aloud and laugh. That laughter, they said, never reached his eyes. Still, Rome wanted to believe, because what choice did they have? They called it a golden beginning, and for a few brief weeks maybe it was. But history is rarely made in parades or proclamations. It's made in what comes next, and what came next would change everything. Because just as the empire began to embrace him, Caligula fell ill, violently, mysteriously, and without warning. And when he awoke, something in him had changed. The 100-day honeymoon was over. What returned from that sickbed was no longer the emperor Rome had celebrated, but something far more dangerous. It began with a headache, then fever, then tremors, then silence. Just a few months into his reign, while Rome was still drunk on joy and celebration, Caligula collapsed. No one knows exactly why. Some say it was poison, served quietly by a rival senator, perhaps even a member of the imperial family. Others believe it was natural, a sudden illness, a virus, a consequence of years spent among the shadows of Capri. But whatever it was, it hit fast, and it hit hard. For weeks he drifted between life and death. His body weakened, his skin turned gray. Priests offered sacrifices. Doctors whispered conflicting remedies. Prayers echoed across the empire. The city that had once rejoiced at his arrival now stood frozen in dread. Rome had seen emperors die, but never so young, never so soon, and never with so much at stake. At his bedside, attendants waited. The Senate sent envoys. The Praetorian Guard tripled their watch. And still, no one knew if the boy who had promised rebirth would live to see the summer. But then, he opened his eyes, and everything changed. He recovered, miraculously. But something inside him did not return. Those who had known him before, those who had seen his warmth, his charm, his efforts to please, now found only glassy silence and slow, unsettling stares. The emperor walked again, but differently. He spoke, but his tone had sharpened. What had once been a young ruler filled with potential now felt like something else entirely. Many ancient sources, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and Pliny, describe this moment not just as a medical event, but as a transformation, as if illness had cracked open a door inside him, and something darker had stepped through. And modern historians? They ask new questions. Was it encephalitis? A fever that inflamed the brain and altered his cognition? Lead poisoning from the empire's pipes and wines? A tumor? Or even temporal lobe epilepsy, known to trigger spiritual visions, divine delusions, and sudden mood swings? There's no diagnosis, no proof, only symptoms. What we do know is what came next. Caligula began to speak of himself not as a man, but as something more. He claimed he had died and returned, not just from fever, but from fate itself. He told his council that the gods had spoken to him in dreams, that his survival was proof of divinity, that Rome had not been saved by medicine or prayer, but by the will of the god they now served. He began dressing not in imperial robes, but in the garments of Jupiter, Apollo, and Venus. He ordered statues of the gods be decapitated, so that his own likeness could be placed upon their shoulders. He didn't just demand loyalty, he demanded worship. And Rome, stunned, obeyed. Some say it was grief, finally uncoiling after years of silence. Others say it was the illness. But those closest to him whispered another possibility, that when he brushed up against death, he liked what he saw. And from that moment forward, Caligula was no longer content to rule men. He would rule like a god, and gods do not ask permission. Marble temples, once filled with the serene faces of Jupiter, Mars, and Venus, now stood mutilated in eerie silence. Sculptors worked day and night, not to carve new gods, but to remove the old ones, sawing away centuries-old heads so that Caligula's own likeness could be bolted in their place. In the forum, citizens stared at the freshly altered statues, Jupiter's thunderbolt still clutched in a marble fist, but above it, Caligula's youthful, hollow-eyed grin. It was blasphemy made visible, a declaration that Rome's traditional order owed its very identity to a single living man. Priests muttered prayers they no longer believed, senators applauded from trembling hands, and the populace, raised to fear omens, watched the sky for lightning that never came. And because no heavenly bolt struck him down, Caligula took divine silence as proof. The gods had surrendered. Dressing now in robes woven with gold thread, he paraded through the Capitoline, flanked by incense bearers who chanted his names: Caesar, Jupiter, Apollo, Augustus, a litany that turned worship into propaganda. But Rome was only the beginning. Power hungers for distance, and Caligula's gaze drifted eastward to a hilltop city where an invisible god was worshipped above all images. In Jerusalem's temple, the very heart of Jewish faith, no statue stood, no face dared depict the divine. For Caligula, that emptiness was an affront. If Rome's pantheon could bow, why not Judea's invisible deity? So he issued an order that chilled the eastern provinces: erect a colossal bronze statue of himself inside the Holy of Holies. News raced down dusty roads and across Mediterranean harbors faster than legions could march. In Judea, outrage erupted. To place an image in that sacred space was more than sacrilege. It was an existential wound. Governor Petronius hesitated, knowing the command meant open revolt. He stalled, wrote desperate letters. Meanwhile, Philo of Alexandria penned a diplomatic plea, warning that the empire was on the brink of igniting a religious war that even Rome's legions could not easily contain. Caligula, though, reveled in the chaos. Letters from the east did not temper his ambition. They amused him. He told advisors the Jews were stubborn children. He would teach them obedience. Yet one voice pierced through the emperor's vanity. Herod Agrippa I, a childhood companion now king of Judea's neighboring realm. Agrippa arrived in Rome with gifts, flattery, and a single strategy: appeal to the sliver of nostalgia Caligula still held for old friendships. Over lavish dinners, he spoke not of politics, but of memories. The Capri nights they survived, the jests they shared under Tiberius's suspicious gaze. Something in those recollections briefly softened the emperor's resolve. The statue order was revoked, officially at least, and a regional catastrophe was averted. But the empire had seen how far its ruler would go. Priests in Rome whispered of omens that felt too real. Merchants in Antioch kept quiet for fear of Rome's spies. And soldiers in Syria wondered whether their next campaign might be against civilians guarding a temple rather than an enemy army. Caligula interpreted their unease as worship, their silence as awe. He believed every boundary he pushed proved his divinity. In his mind, sacrilege was not sin, it was statecraft. And statecraft under a self-made god was simply the art of daring the universe to strike him down. It never did, at least not yet. Emboldened, Caligula turned from temples to theaters, from sacred icons to living bodies, ready to display his power on a grander, bloodier stage. The next decree would not target statues or holy walls. It would target human lives under the blazing sun of the arena. And in that sand, the line between entertainment and terror would vanish forever. Colosseums were Rome's mirrors, reflecting back whatever its rulers wanted the people to see. Under Caligula, they no longer reflected courage or skill, they reflected fear. Morning after morning, citizens filed into marble stands expecting sport, only to discover they were part of a lesson in obedience. The emperor arrived not as a spectator but as a stage master, dressed in shimmering capes, flanked by praetorians who watched the audience as closely as they watched the arena. He would survey the tiers, searching for a particular expression, boredom, irritation, even a glance of fatigue, then raise a finger. Guards would seize the unfortunate soul and hurl him, her, sometimes entire families, into the sand below. There, wild animals paced behind hidden gates, waiting for Caligula's nod. Lions were released, cheers forced, and the crowd learned that enthusiasm was now a survival skill. His cruelty, however, was not confined to public spectacle. In marble courtrooms, he transformed legal proceedings into one-man dramas. Senators accused of trivial infractions, failing to praise a new statue loudly enough, owning a villa he coveted, were summoned before him. Caligula would sit in silence as prosecutors recited charges he had authored. Witness testimony was irrelevant. Verdicts had been scripted the night before. Once, a wealthy knight attempted a defense, citing precedents and quoting law. Caligula interrupted only to ask about the man's country estate, its gardens, its view, the color of its mosaic floors. Minutes later, the knight was condemned and his property graciously accepted into the imperial portfolio. The lesson was clear. Legal innocence was a myth. The only real statute was the emperor's desire. Even daily rituals became opportunities for domination. Walking through the forum, he might order a baker's entire day's bread dumped on the pavement because the loaves were too plain for divine taste, forcing the merchant to kneel and beg while hungry children watched. At dinner parties, he requested random toasts to the beauty of death, then pointed to a guest and described in detail how that person might die if the toast displeased him. Laughter was mandatory. Silence could be fatal. Servants learned to anticipate his whims, rearranging furniture hour by hour because he claimed stationary chairs offended the gods, repainting corridors overnight because he dreamed in new colors. Exhaustion spread like fog through the palace, yet no one dared falter. Fatigue itself was an insult to his divinity. Why did Rome tolerate it? Because terror was theatrical, and theater was Rome's heartbeat. Spectacle bought silence, and silence preserved power. A city fed with adrenaline and dread rarely has appetite left for rebellion. Caligula understood that brutal arithmetic. Every public execution, a senator disemboweled on the Senate floor, a citizen sawn in half at dawn, was both punishment and advertisement. Every confiscated estate replenished the treasury he bled dry on jewels and banquets. The arena's sand soaked up blood and dissent alike, while the courts laundered theft into legality. And everyday petty cruelties reminded 30 million subjects that their fates rested on one man's shifting mood. Yet even an emperor's appetite for horror is finite, and Caligula soon hungered for something grander, something unprecedented, luxury so vast it could float upon a lake. If the gods would not strike him in their temples, perhaps they would envy him on water. And so he turned his mind from lions and lawsuits to marble decks, gilded oars and palaces built to drift beneath the open sky, preparing to write the next chapter of excess on the still waters of Lake Nemi. Far from Rome's dust and judgment, Caligula discovered a mirror-still crater lake south of the city, Lake Nemi, a place poets called Diana's Looking Glass. Here he decided marble should float. Engineers were summoned, carpenters ordered to forget every law of weight, and within months, 2 leviathans took shape. Wooden hulls the length of football fields, clad in bronze anchors, with decks paved in Egyptian alabaster, porphyry columns rising like forest trunks, mosaic floors depicting constellations, even central heating pipes of lead so hot they could warm a winter banquet. Gardens of citrus and myrtle bloomed on the aft terraces, fountains hissed fresh water into gilded basins, private baths shimmered under glass tiles the color of the Aegean. These were not ships, they were palaces set adrift, each voyage a moving festival of music, incense, and flesh. Senators whispered that a single vessel cost more than 10 legion campaigns. Grain traders groaned as new taxes emptied warehouses. Provincial governors received frantic orders to seize estates, auction artworks, and funnel silver to the imperial dockyards. In the city, bread prices doubled. On Lake Nemi, Caligula lounged beneath silk canopies, watching dancers twirl on marble that once paved a temple floor. When winds were calm, he claimed the lake obeyed him. When storms churned, he laughed that even Jupiter envied his floating throne. The economics of excess were simple arithmetic. Confiscate, spend, repeat, and let the empire tighten its belt so the emperor could loosen his. Decades later, Mussolini's divers would raise rusted bronze and charred timber from the mud, proof that the legend was carved in planks and porphyry, not merely in rumor. But for Rome at the time, the cost was immediate. Depleted treasuries, famine-stoked riots, soldiers paid with IOUs instead of coin. And yet Caligula saw only the shimmering reflection of his own glory on that lake's surface, a mirror so mesmerizing he almost forgot the shoreline, where hungry citizens and humiliated senators waited for the next humiliation, the next decree, the next impossible demand. It would arrive soon enough, in the shape of a stallion draped in purple, cantering toward the consul's seat. Incitatus lived in a marble stall lined with purple blankets, dined on gilded oats mixed with flakes of gold, and slept beneath a ceiling painted with the very constellations that guided Rome's legions. Each dawn, slaves polished his emerald-studded harness, while trumpeters announced his schedule to a city still waking from hunger. Caligula adored the spectacle. He invited senators to banquets where the stallion was seated at the place of honor, sipping wine from an ivory trough, while Rome's most dignified statesmen bowed and toasted the animal's wisdom. When murmurs rose that the court had become a circus, Caligula smiled and drafted a decree naming Incitatus consul. It was more than mockery. It was a mirror held to the Senate's face, reflecting its own impotence. Yet the horse was only Act 1. For Act 2, Caligula appeared before the same chamber, wearing the shimmer of Venus, a golden breastplate shaped to a woman's form, a wig of cascading curls, rouge on his cheeks. Senators who had once recited Cato's stoic virtues now knelt in toga folds and called him goddess. Any hesitation, one raised eyebrow, one delayed clap, could end in confiscation, exile, or the arena. And so the governing class, guardians of the Republic's memory, strangled itself with silence. They signed away estates, applauded imperial love poems, and convinced themselves survival was a form of service. But fear can ferment into fury. Night after night, whispered alliances formed in shadowed porticos. One name surfaced again and again, Cassius Caria, the Praetorian officer Caligula mocked for his soft voice and called girl in public. While the emperor rehearsed new costumes, blades were being sharpened just beyond the glow of palace torches, because even a senate that has forgotten how to speak can still remember how to conspire. Cassius Caria's humiliation began with a nickname, Lady. The emperor would purr, imitating the guard captain's soft voice while the court laughed. Week after week, Caligula summoned him to recite passwords laced with obscenity, Priapus saves, Venus desires, mocking both rank and masculinity. Every snicker sharpened Charia's resolve, and in the lamplight of officers' quarters, a plot took shape. Senators stripped of fortunes, Praetorians denied bonuses. Even palace scribes, tired of rewriting laws to suit a horse. All found common purpose in silence. They mapped the palace like surgeons studying an artery, seeking the narrowest point through which power could bleed. They chose the cryptoporticus, a low-ceilinged service corridor beneath the Palatine, where marble walls funneled footsteps into echoes and torchlight into shadow. The date was set, 24 January, 41 AD. A festival of theatrical games would pull the city's gaze toward the theater, while Caligula, between acts, would walk the passageway to meet his Greek performers. Chaerea arranged the guard rotation so loyalists flanked both entrances. The watchword for the day, spoken with bitter irony, was, "Jupiter saves." As the emperor entered, clad in a purple cloak still dusted with arena sand, a young officer approached with a petition, "Pretend business to slow his stride." From behind, Chaerea raised his tribune's dagger and drove the blade below the shoulder, severing breath mid-word. Caligula spun, eyes wide, not with pain, he had felt that before, but with disbelief that anyone dared break the script. Another conspirator thrust a sword into his chest. A third slashed his legs so he could not flee. In moments, the self-proclaimed god lay twitching on the mosaic floor, blood darkening the tesserae he had ordered inlaid only weeks earlier. Nearby, his German bodyguards pounded locked doors, too late to intervene. The assassins pressed on. His pregnant wife Caesonia was cut down, his infant daughter dashed against a wall. Mercy was a currency none of them could now afford. Above ground, word spread like wildfire through marble courtyards. Senators rushed to convene, daring to dream of a restored republic, while Praetorians, suddenly leaderless, scoured corridors until they found Claudius trembling behind a curtain. Before nightfall, the guards had lifted him onto a hastily built litter, hailing a new emperor even as Caligula's corpse cooled. In the cryptoporticus, torches guttered out, leaving only the smell of blood and the faint echo of laughter that no one would dare repeat. Rome had severed the head of its nightmare, but by dawn the empire would learn that killing a tyrant is easier than curing the sickness he leaves behind. Caligula's body was burned, his memory condemned by the Senate, and his name chiseled from countless inscriptions. Yet 2,000 years later, he still refuses to stay buried. Why? Because every generation finds its own reflection in his excess. Victorian moralists held him up as proof that decadence invites divine wrath. Cold War analysts cited him as a case study in personality cults, and today's pop culture engine transforms his atrocities into clickbait reels, HBO cameos, and the notorious 1979 film that pushed the boundaries of shock long before streaming platforms made outrage routine. His floating palaces inspire yacht life influencers. His seashell trophies resurface as viral memes about meaningless victories. His horse consul stunt reappears whenever a CEO installs an unqualified relative in a boardroom. Historians still argue over the diagnosis. Was it encephalitis, lead poisoning, or simply the corrosive physics of absolute power? Scholars like Alois Winterling point to systemic enablers, senators who traded integrity for survival, while behavioral economists dissect his reign for cautionary tales about perverse incentives. Leadership seminars borrow his name for the Caligula effect, a warning that charismatic promise can curdle into cruelty the moment feedback vanishes. In classroom debates, students note how quickly a populace acclimates to horror when violence is wrapped in spectacle, an insight uncomfortably relevant in a news cycle that monetizes outrage. Even game designers cite him when crafting villain arcs that escalate from charming to chilling in a heartbeat, because Caligula's narrative still maps perfectly onto modern story grids. Meteoric rise, fevered break, god-complex climax, violent fall. Yet beneath the gore and gossip lies a subtler legacy: the Senate's capitulation. Their slow suicide, applause for a horse, silence for injustice, rings louder than any scream from the arena. Caligula haunts us because he exposes a truth institutions hate to confess. Tyranny thrives less on the madness of one man than on the cowardice of many. The question his story forces upon every boardroom, parliament, and algorithm-driven platform is disquietingly simple. When power leaps the rails, who among us will speak before the blades come out? And that, perhaps, is why his shadow lingers across documentaries and dinner table arguments alike. We study Caligula not just to recoil at the past, but to place a trembling finger on the fault lines of the present. Searching for the moment applause becomes complicity, entertainment becomes terror, and a leader crosses the invisible line from mortal to monster. Because somewhere beyond the next headline or viral clip, another little boots may already be rehearsing his entrance. The stage is set, the audience waits. What role will we choose when the curtain rises?